Order. The Minister has the call.
Speaker.
Order.
Mr Speaker, I've not seen the proposal, but I'd certainly welcome a debate on nuclear energy from those who sit opposite as part of our future energy mix, and it should include also a debate on how that all fits together in terms of the extra money that we're already putting into low-emission coal, low-emission gas.
Order. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I'll continue.
The Minister resume his seat. The member. Order. They haven't called the member yet. Member's on my right. The member for Lily on point of order.
It was a very specific question. What discussions has the Minister had?
Order. I remind the member for Lily, if he wants to take a point of order, he should be quite clear on what the point is. He will not debate it. I call the Minister. Order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'd welcome a debate. In fact, I'd also welcome for the Leader of the Opposition to copy this government, the Howard government's uranium policy, and also have the premiers of each state copy our uranium policy, because until we can actually mine the uranium in each state, we can't export it. Now, Mr Speaker, I have here a media statement that was just passed to me. The Australian community and the media statement is from the company Australian Nuclear Energy Proprietary Limited, and the statement says the Australian community will ultimately decide the best way to provide sustainable energy for our country, and I would hope that that would be through a debate. I know the Leader of the Opposition likes debates.
Order. Mr
Speaker, the press release, the media statement goes on and says the Australian Nuclear Energy Proprietary Limited is a private company established to examine potential commercial responses to future energy needs. A&E Company Secretary Mr Bruce Fitzgerald says that contrary to today's media reports, the company has not put forward a proposal to build nuclear power plants in Australia. The company will make no further comment.
I see. So you've had discussions, but it's to have no further comment.
Order. The honourable member for Blair.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Would the Prime Minister update the House on how the government is assisting parents with the education of their children?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Blair, and in answering that question, can I say that the federal government is assisting the parents of Australia to educate their children in a number of ways, based on a number of principles. The first and most important principle is freedom of parental choice. I make it plain, Mr Speaker, that it's a cornerstone of our education policy that parents have a right to choose, an unfettered right to choose the type of education they regard as suitable for their children. I make that observation, Mr Speaker, in the wake of the release of some ABS schools statistics which shows a continued drift of children from government to non-government schools, and we now have 1.1 million, or one-third of all students are now attending non-government schools in Australia. Now, that is not something, Mr Speaker, that I necessarily welcome, because as well as believing very strongly in freedom of choice, I believe very strongly that the basis of a good education system in this country is a vibrant, strong, well-based, well-resourced public education system. And if parents are to have genuine freedom of choice, then the offerings of a strong public system have to constitute a very important part of that choice. But I have to say, Mr Speaker, in the wake of the release of these statistics, we've had, regrettably, the usual responses from state education ministers and leaders of the teacher unions. The Victorian Education Minister, John Lenders, said that the figures reflected the Howard government's funding priorities, Mr Speaker, implying that in some way our funding had shortchanged parents who send their kids to government schools and favoured those who send their children to non-government schools. He neglects to acknowledge that in the almost 11 years that we have been in power, direct federal government funding for government schools has risen by 118%, while the enrolments in government schools over that same period have increased by only 1.2%. It remains the case, Mr Speaker, as if you make allowance for that share of general revenue payments by the Commonwealth of the states that is used by the states to fund public education, which you must do if there is to be any fair statistical comparison, you find that government schools, which now enrol 67% of students, receive 75% of all government funding, while non-government schools that enrol 33% of students receive 25% of funding. Now, they are unarguable statistics, and they are contributed to by the Commonwealth's direct payments that have gone up 118%, and also the payments through the GST, which figures revealed today have the states in the current financial year $2 billion better off than they would have been under the old financial sharing arrangements, Mr Speaker. And it's echoed again by Mary Blewett of the Australian Education Union's Victorian branch, said it goes on to attack the federal government for allegedly, and it's a false accusation, shortchanging government schools. The reality is that under the Schools Assistance Act, the more that states increase their payments to government schools, the more the Commonwealth's payments go up, because the two are linked through a formula written into the Act. So, Mr Speaker, those who are concerned that too many parents are taking their children out of government schools, and I understand those concerns because I do not want to see, and the government does not want to see, the government system weakened. But can I say to state education ministers, can I say to the leaders of the teacher unions, instead of falsely blaming the federal government, why don't you ask the parents why they've made a different choice? And if you ask parents, they don't say it's because the federal government doesn't give enough money. Parents talk about standards, they talk about discipline, they talk about values, they talk about a whole range of things, Mr Speaker. Now, I think the parents are the people who should be listened to, because in the end, we exist as governments to serve the choices of parents. We don't exist as governments to serve particular ideologies, and we don't exist to serve a preference for the private over the state or the state over the private. One of the great pieces of genius of the Australian achievement, Mr Speaker, is that we've always been able to achieve a sense of balance between public and private provision. What I want in education is an Australia where parents have that unfettered choice, and I think people who worry about the drift between government and private schools, instead of falsely blaming the federal government, they should talk to the parents and find out why they have exercised their choice in a particular direction.
Order. I inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon members of a parliamentary delegation from the European Parliament. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to our visitors. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Minister for Industry. Has the Minister had discussions with any representative of Australian Nuclear Energy Limited or not?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources. Order. Order. The Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I say that I would welcome a discussion from this company, and I would like to see Australia have a debate on nuclear energy and where it fits into our future energy mix. And of course, any proponent of a nuclear power station in Australia would need bipartisan support from both sides of this House before they would invest their money in a power station. So I would like to have the meeting and I would like to have the debate.
The Honourable Member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Treasurer. Would the Treasurer inform the House of recent data on the Australian economy? What does this indicate about the government's economic management?
The Honourable Treasurer.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Stirling for his question, and I can inform the House that the Census Business Index for small and medium enterprises was released today, and this is the most comprehensive survey of small and medium-sized business in Australia. There are 1.96 million trading businesses in Australia, and 95% of them are small businesses. Mr Speaker, the survey today showed that confidence has risen in the small and medium enterprise sector by 6 percentage points to a net balance of 56%. And expectations about the economy rose strongly, with a net 13% of SMEs believing the economy would be better in a year's time. This is the first positive result since May of 2006 and the highest result in 2 years. The report also asks whether the small and medium enterprise sector has a net favourability for particular levels of government. And, Mr Speaker, I can inform the House that the government in Australia, which is the most supported government by small and medium enterprises, is the federal government, Mr Speaker, and the assessment of federal government policies rose to a net balance of positive 11%. Now, Mr Speaker, lest someone thinks, well, that's not much, the least supported government in Australia by small and medium enterprises was the New South Wales government, which had a net favourability of minus 34%, Mr Speaker. This is the 12th successive quarter the New South Wales government has recorded the lowest result of any state and territory. And the key reason why small and medium enterprises don't support the New South Wales government, they name it as having too much bureaucracy and too high taxes, Mr Speaker. So I noticed in the paper this morning that the Treasurer of New South Wales, Mr Costello, says that he's being persecuted because of his ethnic background. Can I suggest to Mr Costello, it is not his parents, it's his policies that are the problem in New South Wales. Where you have a state which has trailed the rest of Australia, where you have a state which has high bureaucracy and high taxes, it is no excuse to say that there's some kind of ethnic component in the favourability rating of the New South Wales government. The New South Wales government stands at minus 34%. If it wants to win back the confidence of small and medium enterprises, it ought to do something about its bureaucracy, something about its taxes, support improved industrial relations and take a leaf out of coalition policy.
I inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon members of a parliamentary delegation from the Republic of Poland, led by Mr Bogdan Borusewicz, Speaker of the Senate of the Republic of Poland. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to our visitors. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Industry Minister. I refer to the Minister's answer to my last question, where he said he would welcome discussions with Australian Nuclear Energy Limited. My question to the Minister is, has the Minister already had discussions with Australian Nuclear Energy Limited?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Well, Mr Speaker, I know the member for Hunter is a supporter of nuclear energy because he said it on the radio.
Order. Order. The member for Fowler.
Mr Speaker, we are always happy to see a proposal of any type in my office, and I have not seen the proposal from this company put before me in my office. Now, Mr Speaker,
the member for Jagga.
We need to have the debate.
Order.
There needs to be a bipartisan position. One thing I don't understand is why the Labor Party, or some parts of the Labor Party, it's a shame the member for Batman's not here, but it make sense to me that some parts of the Labor Party say we can export uranium to our friends and they can use it to lower greenhouse gas emissions by using it in baseload nuclear power stations, but they don't want to have a debate here in Australia about nuclear energy.
The honourable member for Riverina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The member for Riverina has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Transport and Regional Services. Would the Deputy Prime Minister advise the House how the government's $10 billion national water plan will protect investment in regional jobs in my electorate of Riverina and in rural areas generally? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any proposals that might undermine investment in our regional economies?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Riverina for her question and her great interest in the issues surrounding water security and the sustainability of regional economies in those areas that rely on water security. And we certainly understand, Mr. Speaker, that water security, particularly throughout the Murray-Darling Basin, underpins regional development prospects in all those communities throughout that region. Mr. Speaker, the member for Riverina asked about our $10 billion national water plan, and of course it needs to be said at the outset, Mr. Speaker, that this would not be possible. It would not be possible for our government to be putting this proposal forward, to be encouraging the states to commit with the Commonwealth on this investment and on this nation-building scheme if it hadn't have been for the good economic management of the economy over the last 11 years to put us in a position where we can afford to invest this money. 11 years ago, the nation would never have been able to afford to invest this amount of money in what is a critical national issue. And now we have the Labor Party wanting to sort of put their hand up and say, me too, after opposing every inch of the way the hard work the nation's put in to achieve this economic outcome so that we can afford these investments in much-needed infrastructure. And so we have the Labor spokesman going out and saying, we'll do this and we'll do that. We've had the member for Grayndler actually promising to free money for state projects. Mr. Speaker, we know that that's what this Labor Party is all about, is being beholden to state governments. Mr. Speaker, we also know that they want to punish farmers and regional communities for the mistakes of state governments in the over-allocation of water rights. Mr. Speaker, well, we will not punish farmers nor regional communities for the mistakes that state governments have made, and we make no apology for that. And that's why we put this package together, so we can sensibly approach an issue that we need to address. So where it exists, Mr. Speaker, over-allocation will be addressed firstly through efficiency savings in the system. That's why we've indicated we're prepared to invest $6 billion into efficiency savings so that we can address that over-allocation issue. And secondly, as a last resort, we are prepared to purchase water rights in the marketplace from willing sellers. But we want to generate the efficiency savings first because we believe that there is a significant amount of water that can be saved in that regard. And, Mr. Speaker, we will engage all stakeholders to provide us with advice and guidance from top to bottom on this issue and every step of the way. We want to engage in a genuine partnership with those regional communities to enhance and ensure the prosperity of those regional communities, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin area. Now, Labor's alternative, and the member for Grayndler outlined this in a speech yesterday, is to blame the farmers for over-allocation. They blame the farmers for over-allocation.
Order.
Not put the finger on the state governments. Not put the finger on the state governments who made the over-allocation. He's out there saying he's going to free up money and give to the state governments. Where's he going to get the money from? He's going to get the money from the good management of this government that you opposed, that he opposed every inch of the way.
Order.
So he didn't want us to make the savings. He didn't want us to improve the economic circumstances in Australia. But now that it's been done, he wants to grab the money and go and spend it, Mr. Speaker. So that the member for Grayndler should get out into the countryside and talk to a few of the producers around the place. The member for Grayndler says that on the one hand the price of water should be higher, but he won't say how high. He wants to tell farmers what crops they want to grow. He wants to tell farmers what crops they should be. What crops they should be growing. Can I just tell the member for Grayndler that the market should set the price of water. The market should determine what crops farmers grow, not some central committee of the ALP Politburo, Mr Speaker. So he says that the Murray needs a drink, but he doesn't acknowledge that there's a drought on. One of his comments he made in this speech, he said, Labor firmly believes that the over-allocation of water licences is a primary source of the water crisis. Well, the primary source of the water crisis, there's a drought on. There's a drought on at the moment. I don't know whether you'd noticed, but there's a drought on. And we want to responsibly address better managing water resources for a sustainable future. It's quite clear, Mr Speaker, as we travel around regional Australia, that working families in regional Australia, they know the Labor Party's form on forestry, the decisions they took at the last election at the last moment. They know their form on coal mining, their attitude towards coal mining versus climate change. We know their form on uranium mining and the deployment of uranium, and that the regional communities do not trust Labor on the management of water in the future, Mr Speaker. Labor tries to be all things to all people. They've spent 11 years opposing the government's measures to improve the economy, and now they want to get their hands on the loot and spend the benefits of that hard work. Well, no amount of gloss on top of this new team in the Labor Party is going to hide the rust that we know exists underneath, where they're anti-jobs, anti-development and anti-regional Australia.
I inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon Mr Helge Sander, Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation of the Kingdom of Denmark. On behalf of the House, I extend to him a very warm welcome. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Industry Minister. When did the Minister meet with Australian Nuclear Energy Limited? And given the Minister has now been asked this question 4 times and has refused to answer, what does the Minister have to hide about the government's nuclear reactor plans for Australia?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Mr Speaker, we have absolutely nothing to hide about our nuclear policy.
Order! Order! Order!
Mr Speaker,
Order! The Minister has the
can
call.
I just explain to those who sit opposite that, because I know they don't understand business and business principles, but I'm the business portfolio, and people come and see me all the time and talk to me about a whole range of issues, and my constituents come and talk to me and talk about the whole range of issues. And I do not disclose my diary usually. But today, I will say that this morning, my PA, Colleen Robertson, did a search of my diary for Australian Nuclear Energy Proprietary Limited to see if they've met with me, and the search revealed nothing.
Order! The Minister's in his seat. The member for Oxley will remove himself under Standing Order 94A. The Minister has been asked a serious question. He will be given the courtesy of being heard when he gives his answer. I call the Minister.
Mr Speaker, can I also say that I don't recall discussing this proposal with these 3 gentlemen. And,
Order!
And if someone is able to remind me of when I did, I will correct the record.
The Honourable Member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Is the Minister aware of calls to reduce Australia's commitment to the war on terror, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Member for Burke. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I appreciate the honourable member's question. And, Mr Speaker, this government has been determined that Australia should play its part in the war against terrorism. And I think all of us felt very deeply about the Australians who were killed in Bali and in other incidents, and That just reinforced our determination to strike back at terrorists and to defeat terrorists. Mr Speaker, one of the areas where we make a contribution is in Afghanistan. It's still a very dangerous, particularly southern Afghanistan, is still a very dangerous environment, and we expect there to be, to use a phrase, a spring offensive from the Taliban in the first few months of this year. I welcome the decision by the British government, Mr Speaker, that they will deploy 1,400 more troops to Afghanistan, bringing their total in Afghanistan to 7,700. And I'm proud of the contribution the 550 Australians are making in Afghanistan. And can I just say that we've said this before, the government's sending or has sent a scoping team to Afghanistan to inform our defence planning on possible changes and possible increases to our force structure in Afghanistan, because we are committed to helping the Afghan people, as we are the Iraqi people, to free themselves of the scourge of terrorism. Mr Speaker, I noticed on the 22nd of February that the Leader of the Opposition supported an increase in Australian troops to Afghanistan. This is what he said: "We've always taken a constructive, bipartisan approach to the war against Osama bin Laden and the Taliban." Apparently not al-Qaeda in Iraq, but in any case, if they're in Afghanistan, he's against them. Mr Speaker, this was an interesting statement by the Leader of the Opposition. He supports more troops being sent to Afghanistan, but 6 days earlier, in an interview on Channel 7, he said that we should be withdrawing our troops from Iraq because they are needed back here in our region. This is what he said: "We have other alliance responsibilities in our own region. You've got the Solomons, you've got the problems in Tonga, you've got problems in Fiji. Who knows what's going to happen in parts of New Guinea? We have limited military resources." Now, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition yet again is trying to have it both ways. How can a member of the House of Representatives argue on the one hand we should bring troops back because we need them in our own region, but he supports sending more troops to Afghanistan, Mr Speaker? You don't have to be a Philadelphia lawyer to work out that there is a stark and embarrassing contradiction, Mr Speaker.
The member for Melbourne Ports.
This, of course, is what we have been treated to for the last 2 months from the Leader of the Opposition. What, of course, we who followed the foreign affairs debate through the last 5 years were treated to, that he supports every imaginable position. Troops out of Iraq because we need more troops in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, but more troops can go to Afghanistan, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, even the Labor Party can work out that there is a contradiction there. And there's one final contradiction, which is a pretty fundamental one, Mr Speaker. Why is it that it is so important to fight terrorism in Afghanistan, but it doesn't matter what happens in Iraq? It doesn't matter that the terrorists have a great victory in Iraq, but it does in Afghanistan. Mr Speaker, if you ask me, that is a pretty silly sort of position.
The Chief
and it
Opposition
is a
Whip.
position not driven by strength of policy or conviction, not driven by belief, not driven by a desire to do the right thing by our country, our allies and our friends around the world. It is driven by grubby politics.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
My question again is to the Industry Minister, and it follows our 4 previous questions. I refer also to the Minister's answer to the previous question, where he said that his PA did a search of his diary and could not find any entry of a meeting with Australian Nuclear Energy, and further that he could not recall a meeting with the 3 individuals referred to, presumably in today's paper. Minister, the question is, have you had any discussions with any individual from Australian Nuclear Energy Limited?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Representing Australian Nuclear Energy Limited, no.
He came in from Fairfax to change their attitude.
Order. Members are holding up their own question time. The honourable member for Dobell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Treasurer. Would the Treasurer outline to the House the latest information on superannuation funds under management in Australia and what this means for national savings?
The Honourable the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Dobell for his question. Today, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released data on managed funds, which showed in the December quarter of 2006 total consolidated assets of managed funds increased 4.6% and grew to nearly $1.1 trillion. So, Mr Speaker, let me say that again. The amount of managed funds in Australia as at the end of December 2006 is now about $1.1 trillion. Mr Speaker,
the member for Hotham and the Attorney General. They want to have a conversation, they can go outside.
Mr Speaker, that's managed funds. That does not include self-managed superannuation, which is about 23% of superannuation, and managed funds does not include only superannuation. It includes other funds that are under management. Mr Speaker, if you were to bring in self-managed funds for superannuation, of course the savings would be greater than $1.1 trillion. Mr Speaker, the measure of savings in Australia's national accounts has been negative for several quarters, but, Mr Speaker, that measure does not capture the accumulation of assets. This is a point that's been made by Rick Battolino, the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, who said in a speech in August of 2006, "Conventional measures of saving do not take into account capital gains. This has a particular bearing on Australian households because, as noted, they now hold a high proportion of their financial assets in investments such as shares and superannuation, on which a significant part of the return is in the form of capital gains. We showed, once allowance is made for capital gains, the saving rate of Australian households is neither low nor falling." In fact, Mr Speaker, it's estimated by the Reserve Bank of Australia that, looking at household net financial wealth, savings are around 24% of disposable income. This measure suggests that Australia's savings by global standards are actually quite high. This is an important point, Mr Speaker, which has perhaps been overlooked in a lot of the economic commentary up to date. That when you do a household savings ratio and you are looking just at income, you are not allowing for the fact that many Australian households are actually making quite a rational decision to put their savings into better yielding returns, either in the stock market or in superannuation. In many European countries, you might put your money into a bank which then invests, and that is counted in the conventional measure of saving because it's held in a bank. But many Australians have taken quite a rational decision to invest either directly into the share market or to invest through self-managed funds. Mr Speaker, I have no doubt that the volume of money that Australians now have in managed funds and directly in the stock market has contributed greatly to the increase in stock market values. It was estimated at the beginning of this year that the complete market capitalisation of the Australian Stock Exchange was around $1.4 trillion. When you think that managed funds has $1.1 trillion, and there is, in addition to that, considerable self-managed superannuation, you can see there is enormous stock of savings in the Australian economy, which is now looking for a home to invest. And no doubt, Mr Speaker, on cue comes one of the genii of the Labor backbench, who, Mr Speaker, if he listened as much as he talked, Mr Speaker, would have heard me say that managed funds do not include just superannuation. Managed funds include listed property trusts. They include cash management trusts. And I suppose Paul Keating invented the cash management trust, did he? Did he invent the listed
member for
property
Blackstone
trust?
will not debate the question.
I suppose, Mr Speaker, he invented the self-managed superannuation funds. Let me guess, Paul Keating invented the internet.
Now, that was Al Gore.
Sorry, that was Al Gore, Mr Speaker. Paul Keating got an Oscar yesterday, did he? No, Mr Speaker. Some of these people are so out of touch, they haven't seen a good economic policy in so long, they wouldn't know how to recognise one when it came here, Mr Speaker. That's why you can't trust the Labor Party, caught fossilised in a period of time of ignorance, Mr Speaker, until the light of the coalition came and shone on them. And, Mr Speaker, it's going to stay there for a long period of time.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Industry Minister. I refer to the Minister's answer to my previous question, where he said he had not had a meeting with any representative of Australian Nuclear Energy Limited. Has the Minister had discussions with any individual with an interest in Australian Nuclear Energy Limited, including Mr Ron Walker, the former Treasurer of the Liberal Party? Minister, what is the Minister got to hide?
Order. Members on my right. The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Stop pretending to read.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I say it would be very odd for the Minister for Resources not to talk to three prominent people in the investment and resource industry in Australia. Can I just say again, as I thought I'd already said, but perhaps I've got to make it crystal clear, I have not met with the company. I have not met with representatives of the company about this issue, and I have not seen a proposal on a nuclear power station from them.
Order. 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 The Leader of the House. The Honourable Member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. How is Australia supporting progress in the North Korean six-party talks, and what lessons can be learned from achievements to date?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Well, Mr Speaker, first can I thank the Honourable Member for Boothby for his question and, of course, the great interest he has in these issues. And, Mr Speaker, I've said before that we in the Australian Government welcome the 13th of February agreement, which gives a timetable for the dismantling of North Korea's nuclear program. I also would like to take the opportunity, Mr Speaker, of welcoming the announcement that the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed El-Baradei, intends to visit Pyongyang in the next week or so, the week commencing the 12th of March, I think it is actually, and this visit is at the invitation of the North Korean government. So this is a good sign that the North Korean government is moving towards the implementation of the agreement that was announced on the 13th of February. As the House knows, we've worked very closely with the American administration, but also with the Chinese and with the South Koreans and Japanese in relation to the whole issue of North Korea's nuclear tests and its nuclear program. And the agreement that has been reached provides for international assistance to North Korea in return for specific progress towards abandoning its nuclear weapons. With that all in mind, Mr Speaker, I have decided to send an Australian delegation to Pyongyang almost certainly in the week beginning the 5th of March. This will be led by a very senior official in my department and include a number of officials, and they will urge North Korea, first of all, to fulfil its obligations under the agreement that has been reached and, in particular, to dismantle permanently its nuclear programs. And the delegation will indicate that such actions will allow Australia and many other countries in the broader international community to provide the assistance to North Korea that the people, the ordinary people of North Korea, so desperately need. It will also be an opportunity to lay down some markers for the strengthening of a bilateral relationship between Australia and North Korea. The delegation will be able also to check the progress of multilateral aid projects to which we currently contribute. They are basically projects that are associated with food. So, Mr Speaker, I think the delegation should make a useful contribution, particularly bearing in mind the close alliance relationship between Australia and the United States. The delegation will be able to make a useful contribution to sending some messages to the North Korean regime about their obligations and what the broader international community, not just the other 5 parties in the 6-party talks, expect of them, and what benefits North Korea can get out of fulfilling their obligations under the agreement that was announced on the 13th of February.
The honourable member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's statement on the 29th of December 2006 that he would have no objection to a nuclear reactor being located in Bennelong. Does the Prime Minister support the statement by the members for Menzies, Flinders, Gilmore and Curtin, as well as the New South Wales opposition leader Peter Dednam, who have indicated their opposition to having one of the 25 reactors in their seats? Will the Prime Minister rule out a nuclear power reactor in Bennelong?
Order. The honourable order. Order. The honourable Prime Minister. Order. The member for Blair.
Mr Speaker, I haven't seen the statement attributed to my colleagues, but I'm sure that, as is their custom, Mr Speaker, they make very sensible statements. My position on nuclear power is that I think this country should examine the nuclear option. It is too early to be talking about individual locations because...
Order.
Well, Mr Speaker...
Order. Order.
Mr Speaker...
Order.
I know the game that the opposition is playing. They may think it is clever short-term politics.
Order. The member for Fowler.
But it is doing a great deal of long-term damage to a sensible debate in this country. I welcome the fact that 3 prominent Australian businessmen have formed a company to look at the issue of nuclear power generation, and I would think it completely unexceptionable that they might have had some contact with the government, Mr Speaker. So let me make, I listened with fascination to all of the questions asked by the leader of the opposition, Mr Speaker.
The deputy leader of the opposition.
Turns on somebody who, according to the Premier of South Australia, is a good enough advisor on the business affairs of South Australia to sit at the cabinet table with the Labor Premier, Mr Walker, who was, I'm very happy to say, honorary federal treasurer of the Liberal Party, and a very good one, Mr Speaker. He's now the chairman of John Fairfax Limited, and Robert Champion de Crepney, who, amongst other things, as well as being a very successful businessman, was also a member some years ago of the Council for Reconciliation, and devoted a great deal of time to improving relations between the Indigenous population and the rest of the Australian population. But I would just say to the member for Parramatta, I think this nation, if it is serious about climate change, has to look at the nuclear option. I'm not frightened of that. I'm not ruling out power stations anywhere in this country. That is a juvenile, idiotic game to play, Mr Speaker. If you are interested, Mr Speaker, if you are interested in a serious debate, you will embrace it.
The member for Jagga is warned.
I do not intend to be diverted from a rational discussion of the nuclear option by this kind of childish scare tactic.
Poor old Peter Dedman is travelling badly before that. What have you done to him?
The honourable member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. Would the Minister update the House on the impact of the government's workplace relation reforms on the Australian economy? Is the Minister aware of any threats to these reforms?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations.
This will be good.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Latrobe for his question. He's a great member for Latrobe.
He's a great member.
Great member. In 1996, the unemployment rate in his electorate was 6.2%. Today it is 3.5%. 3.5%. And, Mr Speaker, I can update the House on the impact of the government's changes to the Labor Party's job-destroying unfair dismissal laws. And I look at the census report, which the Treasurer referred to a little bit earlier, that came out today.
Order.
It's a good report, Mr Speaker, the report notes that already some 10% of small and medium enterprises reported that they have made changes, with putting new workplace agreements into place being the most common action to date. SMEs in the Northern Territory were the most likely to have made changes so far. In the Northern Territory, Snowy, pay attention. Mr Speaker, the Northern Territory member for Solomon, the member for Solomon over there, Mr Speaker, the member for Solomon, in February of last year, in the month before the introduction of work choices, the unemployment rate in the Northern Territory was 6.4%. Today it is 2%. 2%. So, Mr Speaker, there is no doubt. There is no doubt.
Order.
If you add together the census survey together with the outcomes as measured in the unemployment rate, that there is a positive impact associated with the removal of the unfair dismissal laws on small business. So it begs the question, why does the Labor Party want to reintroduce the job-destroying unfair dismissal laws? Why?
Order. Members on my
Mr
right.
Speaker, it could only be that the Rudd-Gillard-Combe combo is going to deliver a platform for the trade union movement to re-enter every
The Minister
workplace.
resume his seat. The Minister resume his seat. The Honourable Chief Opposition Whip on a point of order.
I'd ask that you enforce Standing Order 64.
I've been listening carefully to the Minister, and yes, I believe he could refer to members by their title or by their seat. I call on Minister.
Mr Speaker, the net impact of the Labor Party's job-destroying unfair dismissal laws is that it does cost jobs. Various surveys previously talked about in this place have said it could have an impact up to 77,000 jobs out there in the community. The evidence now clearly illustrates that small business has embraced our work choices changes. Small business has said, yes, we will take the risk in employing people. And, Mr Speaker, when the OECD came out and said only a couple of weeks ago that the unfair dismissal laws set up disadvantaged those most vulnerable, particularly women and young people. They were the most disadvantaged by prescriptive labour laws because it made the risk of employing those people far greater for small business. So why does the Labor Party want to reintroduce these laws? Only because of this pact they have with the trade union movement to let the trade unions back into every workplace, into every small business. The trade unions will run the Labor Party if, on a dark day, they get into government. And, Mr Speaker, that's not just bad for jobs, that's bad for the Australian economy.
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
The question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the government, through the Industry Minister, having secret discussions
Order. Members on my right.
about building nuclear reactors while the government continues to refuse to increase Australia's mandatory renewable energy target?
Order.
Will the Prime Minister...
The members on my right. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has clearly misrepresented what the Industry Minister has said, and he should not be allowed to assert by way of a question what he knows to be false.
Leader of the House, resume his seat. Order. I am listening carefully to the Leader of the Opposition. He has started to ask his question. I will allow him to complete his question. Order. The Leader of the House.
He has claimed in his question that the Industry Minister has been having talks. The Industry Minister has denied that.
Resume his seat. The Leader of the House, resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition has not completed his question. I'll listen to his question. I'll ask him to begin his question again. Order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. questions to the Prime Minister. Why is the government having secret discussions through the industry minister
is warned
about building nuclear reactors while the government continues to refuse to increase Australia's mandatory renewable energy target? Will the Prime Minister support energy renewables rather than nuclear reactors?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. The government is not having any secret discussions, Mr. Speaker, and there was nothing in what the minister said to indicate that. But let me make it very clear, Mr. Speaker.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Talking for myself, Mr. Speaker, the only contact I've had with these three very reputable Australian businessmen is that in about the middle of last year, Mr. Walker, on a telephone conversation I had with him, and I, from time to time, yes, very conspiratorial. I mean, I've only known Mr. Walker for about 20 years, Mr. Speaker, and he's only been, you know, a good fundraiser and a great contributor to our side of politics. So it's really, I mean, this, Mr. Speaker, this is the new politics, Mr. Speaker. This is the new above the ruck, new standard politics. There's something conspiratorial in John Howard talking to Ron Walker. You have got to be kidding. Anyway, I mean, heavens above, I saw the Leader of the Opposition with Ron Walker at the soccer.
Order.
I wonder what they were talking
Members
about,
on my right.
Yeah, what's the
Minister for Employment.
And I tell you what, hey,
Order.
That's only the half of it. Steve Bracks was there too. Really? Look, I had a discussion with Ron Walker. I'm very happy to tell the world that one Saturday morning when Ron rings me, it's not with racing tips. Neither of us are very interested in racing, but it's about something else. And Ron, he said to me, what about the middle of last year? He said that he and Hugh Morgan and Robert de Crespigny had decided to register a company that could be interested in nuclear power. And I said, well, that's a great idea, Ron, because you know my view on it. I don't know what this is all about. My view and the view of the government about nuclear being an option has been well known, Mr. Speaker. The question of whether it ever goes any further will be a matter for commercial decision. I might remind the Leader of the Opposition that the laws of the Commonwealth and the state, as they now stand, prohibit any nuclear power generation in Australia. We will address that issue in relation to the Commonwealth when we give our detailed response to the Swatowski report. But let me just say again to the Leader of the Opposition, if you are serious about climate change, if you want to lead the intellectual debate on this issue, you have to look at every option. You should not bring to the climate change future of Australia or the world a closed mind. You should not bring your ideological prejudices. You should not be overborne by the member for Kingston Smith on this issue. And my challenge to the Leader of the Opposition is to get out in front of the Australian Labor Party, show a bit of policy courage, show a bit of intellectual depth, and acknowledge that if we're serious, we'll look at cleaning up coal, we'll look at wind and solar power at the margin, because you can't run power stations on wind and solar. You'll examine nuclear power. You'll recognise that the mandatory imposition of a higher MRET target, Mr. Speaker, will do great damage to Australian industry, and that was why we were not prepared to go further when we brought out the Energy White Paper. And it's not right of the Leader of the Opposition to say, I reject MRET targets. I don't. I think they should be measured and not place an unreasonable burden on Australian industry. But, Mr. Speaker, let me return to the central point. If this nation is to have a sensible debate about climate change, we have got to look at the cleanest and greenest power generation source of all, and that is nuclear power.
Order. 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 Members are holding up their own question time. The Honourable Member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Health and Ageing. Is the Minister aware of calls for a single funder model of healthcare organisation in Australia? Is support for such a model growing, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Health and Ageing.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do thank the member for Bonner for his question, and I can assure him and the House that the Howard government strongly supports Australia's great Medicare system. Mr Speaker, it's not perfect, but it is at least as good as any health system anywhere in the world. And, Mr Speaker, the principal reason why the Howard government is undeniably the best friend that Medicare has ever had is that many members opposite now want to reform Medicare out of existence. And, Mr Speaker, those that want to reform Medicare out of existence start with none other than the Deputy Leader of the Opposition herself, the former Shadow Minister for Health, the member for Lalor, who has been a consistent supporter of a single funder in place of Australia's existing health programs. As she said to the Tasmanian AMA in May of 2004, the principal characteristic of a unified national health system is that existing Commonwealth health monies, that's to say Medicare, the PBS, aged care funding and health care agreement money, are combined with well, she had a bit of intellectual credibility and honesty, which the current Shadow Mrs. lacks. She said, are combined with existing state and territory health monies, and the combined pool of money is then applied to the population's health needs. So let's be quite clear. Let's be quite clear. As far as the Deputy Leader of the Opposition is concerned, this is the death of Medicare and its replacement by something resembling the UK National Health Service. But she didn't leave that back in 2004. As recently as her Earl Page lecture last year, she said a Labor government would be prepared to examine the need for big changes. That includes a single funder for health care, and she even managed to con her then leader, the member for Brand, who said in his address to the Economic and Social Outlook Conference in Melbourne last November, shifting to a single public funder for health care is on my reform agenda. So she supports it, the former leader supports it, but wait, Mr Speaker, recently we had the Shadow Minister for Federalism come out and say, and I'm quoting the Age of a week or so back, the member for Fraser, Mr McMullen said the single funding model, where the Commonwealth and states would contribute to a common pool of money, had substantial problems. Well, good on the Shadow Minister for Federalism. That would be a bad idea, he said. So, Mr Speaker, who's right? Is it the Deputy Leader of the Opposition who supports a single funder, or the Shadow Minister for Federalism who opposes it? And I say to the Leader of the Opposition, you can't wimp out of taking sides on this one. You've got to take sides on this one. You can't be all things to everyone on this one, but you know, he's a strange piece of work, this bloke, Mr Speaker. He supports the US alliance, but he doesn't support helping America in Iraq. He says he's against greenhouse gas emissions, but he won't support nuclear.
Order. The Leader resume his seat. The honourable member for Wills on the point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The minister was asked about health funding models. I ask you to draw him back to the question he was asked.
The member for Wills resume his seat. I'm sure the Minister for Health and Ageing will come back to the question. I call the Minister.
Making the point that the Leader of the Opposition should resolve this contradiction like he should resolve so many contradictions. He says he's not a socialist, but he is a Christian socialist. He says he's an Anglican, but he's never quite resigned from the Catholic Church. Mr Speaker, will the real Keven Rudd please stand up?
The Minister
not this flunky, Mr Speaker.
Minister resume his seat.
And that's where we'll leave the House of Representatives. You can see a recording of today's Senate question time at 12:30 tonight. And we'll be back at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon with question time from the House of Representatives. Until then, good afternoon from Parliament House in Canberra.
ABC Radio National invites you to join.
Hello and welcome to Parliament House in Canberra. Tonight's question time recording comes from the House of Representatives.
Questions? Are there any questions? The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Minister for Industry, who is responsible for the nuclear industry. Given that the Minister currently has portfolio responsibility for the nuclear industry, I ask him again, will the government rule out imposing nuclear reactors on communities right around Australia by overriding state and territory planning controls?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Well, thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I correct the Leader of the Opposition, who's already made his first mistake at question time. I share nuclear energy with the Minister for Education and Science, and we work very closely together on this, of course, with the Prime Minister and the rest of the Cabinet. Mr Speaker, we're not going to play the Leader of the Opposition's little game on this. What we want first is a debate based on facts, not fear. We want people to be given the opportunity to discuss this matter in a bipartisan environment.
The Honourable Member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Would the Prime Minister update the House on progress of the government's National Water Initiative? How will this help the Australian environment consistent with the prosperity in regional communities? Is there an alternate approach, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Barker for his question. I know how he and all other South Australian members, particularly on this side of the House, care about the health of the Murray-Darling Basin. He will recall the agreement that was reached between me and the Premiers and Chief Minister of 4 of the jurisdictions last Friday, and I'm very hopeful that the Victorian government will see the interests of the people of Victoria as being served by Victoria also joining in the historic commitment by the Commonwealth of an extra $10 billion to secure the health for decades into the future of the Murray-Darling Basin. And the plan that I put forward on behalf of the government and supported by New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia and the ACT is a balanced plan that tackles the fundamental problems of water security, Mr Speaker. It is not a knee-jerk reaction to the problem of water security. It is not an ill-thought-through response to the water crisis that Australia faces. Rather, it is a carefully thought-through, well-crafted proposal that addresses both the seepage and wastage of water in the irrigation system and also the need to tackle the problem of over-allocation. He asked me whether there are any alternative proposals. Well, I saw an alternative proposal this morning, Mr Speaker, emanating from the current National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, President of the Victorian branch of the ALP, and endorsed Labor candidate for Maribyrnong, and a man often touted as a future leader of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party. I'm referring to Mr Bill Shorten, who yesterday called for cotton and rice growers to be forced out of business and their water-intensive crops replaced by less thirsty options such as hemp, Mr Speaker. Now, can I say that what Bill Shorten has done, he's now adding the workers in the rice and cotton industries to the workers in the uranium industry and the coal industry on the Labor Party hit list in relation to knee-jerk responses, Mr Speaker. I mean, it's not enough for the member for Kingsford Smith to go around saying that there can't be an unlimited expansion of the uranium industry. It's not enough for the member for Kingsford Smith to be evasive when it comes to the future of the coal industry, but now we have Bill Shorten, who's coming to Canberra, Mr Speaker. He's got Labor pre-selection for a seat the Labor Party has now held for decades. He's often touted as a future leader of the Labor Party. And you know, the fascinating thing is that he's the secretary of the union whose members would lose their jobs if the rice and cotton industries were put out of business. Now, Mr Speaker, let me make it very, very clear that this country needs balanced agriculture. It needs a balance in water security policies. It also needs balanced agriculture, and that means that you've got to have perennial crops like horticulture, and you've got to have annual crops like rice and cotton, Mr. Speaker. And this idea that you get rid of one of them in the name of saving water is ludicrous. What you do to save water is to introduce proper pricing policies, is to introduce a proper trading system, as postulated by the National Water Initiative, to invest $6 billion in piping and lining the irrigation systems of Australia, and to allocate $3 billion to deal with the problem of over-allocation where necessary by structural adjustment. Bill Shorten is a menace to the job security of workers in the rice and cotton industry, Mr. Speaker, just as the Australian Greens
should remember
and
yesterday's
those
warning.
who would cuddle up to them in the Australian Labor Party are a menace to the job security of people in the uranium and the coal industries of Australia.
I inform the House we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable Ham Linney, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Vanuatu, and the Honourable Willie Jimmy, the Vanuatu Minister for Finance. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to our visitors. The Honourable Member for Kingsford Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry as the Minister responsible for the nuclear industry. Will the Minister release the full submission to the Switkowski inquiry from Nuclear Fuel Leasing Group, a company seeking to build a global nuclear waste dump in Australia?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources. Sorry. Would the member for Kingsford Smith repeat the question? For the benefit of the Minister.
He couldn't hear himself thinking.
My question to the Minister for Industry is the Minister responsible for the nuclear industry. Will the Minister release the full submission to the Switkowski inquiry from Nuclear Fuel Leasing Group, a company seeking to build a global nuclear waste dump in Australia?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
He doesn't object.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't have a full list of who made submissions to that, but I can get you. Mr. Speaker,
Order.
I'm happy to get the
Order.
House
The member
a
for
full
Jagger
list
Jagger.
of who made submissions to that inquiry, and based on the fact that it's not commercial in confidence, which was one of the conditions of releasing that to the public, I will ask those people involved personally if they are happy for the report to be released.
The Honourable Member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is addressed to the Treasurer. Would the Treasurer outline to the House results from the latest Productivity Commission report on the potential benefits of the national reform agenda? Is he aware of any alternative policies?
The Honourable Treasurer.
Mr. Speaker, well, I thank the Honourable Member for Braddon for his question, and I can tell him that the Productivity Commission has done an assessment of the national reform agenda which has been agreed between the Commonwealth and the states at COAG in February of 2006. And the findings of the Productivity Commission are that improvements to competition and regulation could, after a period of around 10 years, increase GDP by 1.75%, or about $17 billion in 2005-06 terms. Mr. Speaker, the reforms that could benefit Australia to that degree on the competition and regulation side include nationally consistent road and rail regulations, including safety and technical standards, the introduction of performance-based standards to promote flexibility and innovation for heavy vehicles, more efficient investment spending on road and rail infrastructure. For electricity, this could arise from structural and organisational changes in the generation sector and enhanced demand-side measures and improved regulatory governance. And for gas, this could result from streamlined regulatory arrangements and the establishment of a spot market for gas. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, the Productivity Commission found that reforms on the human capital stream could, after a period of around 25 years, raise output by about 9%. And the Commission has modelled improvements that would come through increased workforce participation and higher work incentives. So, Mr Speaker, what this assessment by the Productivity Commission has done is it has actually found tangible, real economic benefits to our country as a whole in terms of increased living standards and increased revenues for government from a reform agenda, a wide-ranging agenda to get regulatory reform, Mr Speaker,
Order.
to get regulatory reform
Order.
in these areas. And, Mr Speaker, this, of course, is coming off the back of the last 10 years of the competition agenda, which had been administered under the Competition Principles Agreement, under which the Commonwealth has now distributed billions of dollars to the Labor states, Mr Speaker, according to their progress in relation to reform. And as the person who administered the competition agreement, I can say it was hard work getting those states to the barrier, Mr Speaker.
The member for Hunter.
But the gains are worth it. And this finding by the Productivity Commission finds that the government's next agenda, the next agenda over the years to come in competition, regulation and human capital, have the capacity to drive the economy forward. That's why the Commonwealth is working on them, and they are the gains to be taken from it.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Industry Minister. Is the Industry Minister aware that the Director of Australian Nuclear Energy Proprietary Limited, Mr Hugh Morgan, stated on 12 July 06 that to put together an internationally managed repository, meaning nuclear repository, would bring great standing in the international community for Australia? Does the Minister agree with Mr Morgan? Has the Minister ever discussed this proposal with Mr Morgan? And will the Minister rule out a global nuclear waste dump for Australia?
The Honourable Minister for Industry, Tourism and Resources.
Well, Mr Speaker, I am used to being verbal by those on the other side, and I would like to check the comments
Very wise.
that have just been raised by the Leader of the Opposition.
The Minister has a call.
And when I'm able to do that, I will. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Riverina.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Transport and Regional Services. Would the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the importance of irrigated agriculture to employment and investment in regional Australia, and in particular my electorate of the Riverina? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any threats to our regional economies and that of the rice and cotton industry?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Riverina for her question and recognise her great support of those irrigation industries in her area, particularly the value adding that takes place in the rice industry. Mr Speaker, the irrigation sector of agriculture in Australia employs around 171,000 people, and it's not just the farmers and their families on those farms in those irrigation areas, it's also the farm labourers, but just as importantly, the workers in the processing plants in those industries that are value-adding industries in regional Australia. They include the jobs of the workers in the cotton gins, in the rice mills, in the sugar mills, also irrigated agriculture across Australia. And we think that those people working in those industries do a fantastic job, and they have a great value not just to the Australian economy but particularly to regional economies across Australia. But it's become clear, Mr Speaker, that there are other people in the community who don't value those jobs, and those 171,000 workers throughout those industries we don't think are valued by the Australian Workers' Union or the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, or indeed the Australian Labor Party, as well as the union movement. Mr Speaker, we saw comments this morning from the endorsed candidate from Maribyrnong, who also is the Victorian Labor Party President, and the National Secretary of the AWU, who actually represents a lot of those workers that work in those rice mills, in the sugar mills, in the cotton gins, Mr Speaker. And he said, and was quoted in the paper this morning, union leader and Labor recruit Bill Shorten called yesterday for cotton and rice growers to be forced out of business and their water-intensive crops replaced by less thirsty options such as hemp. Now you'd think that the head of the AWU and someone aspiring to be a minister in this place would take an interest in the sustainability of the jobs in those mills. And he certainly does not, Mr Speaker, he certainly does not, and he's shown that he doesn't care for those workers. Now can I just point out, because he's talking about the scarcity of water and water-intensive crops, rice growers, the rice industry, has reduced its use of water by 30% in the last 10 years. 30%. It's improved its efficient use of water, while at the same time increasing production by 60% over that period of time. The cotton industry has reduced its dependence on water by 18%. Now, they're the sorts of things that you do to sustain an industry, like our government's National Water Plan, rather than harebrained ideas like that from Mr Shorten that is going to put thousands of people out of work, and not just thousands of people, but thousands of his union's members out of work. Now, Mr Speaker, he went on to say, and this is a quote of Mr Shorten's in the article in The Australian, he said, and I quote, "The world wouldn't end if instead of growing cotton, we started growing hemp." Well, Mr Speaker, the world mightn't end, but the world might end for the workers in the rice mills, for the workers in the cotton gins, for the workers in the coal mines, just like the workers in the forestry industry if Labor had have got in at the last election. So the one word of advice we can give to the workers in those industries is don't get between the Labor Party and Green preferences, because you'll lose your job.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Water Resources. If the Minister won't have a nuclear reactor in his electorate, how do you expect others to have one in theirs?
The honourable Minister for Environment, Water. The Minister for Environment and Water Resources.
Mr Speaker, I have no intention of being as foolish as the member for Richmond. I was asked where I would nominate a nuclear reactor to be in my electorate. The smallest electorate in Australia, 25 square kilometres. It would be like asking the member for Richmond, where would you put a nuclear reactor in downtown Murwillumbah?
Order. The member for Grayndler.
It's a stupid question. The member for Richmond.
Order.
The member for Richmond knows it's a stupid question, and she does herself no disservice asking it.
More.
No room. There's no room.
Members are holding up their own question time. The honourable member for Canning.
Mr Speaker, my question is addressed to the Treasurer. Has the Treasurer been notified of any business interest in nuclear energy? What is the role of business lobbyists in relation to economic policy?
The Honourable the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, can I say I've been hearing outside the chamber now for days that I'm going to be asked inside the chamber about what I knew about Mr Walker's company, Australian Nuclear Energy. Chris Bowen promised to ask me on the 27th of February. Peter Garrett promised to ask me.
The Treasurer referred to members by their
on the 27th of February. The member for Jaga promised to ask me. The member for Grayndler said we will be pursuing these questions both inside and outside the parliament over coming days. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased that the member for Canning finally did what the Labor Party didn't. Because, Mr Speaker, as I've already made public, Mr Ron Walker certainly told me that he was forming a company called Australian Nuclear Energy. Just as he told the Prime Minister, just as he told the Premier of Victoria, just as he told the Labor Treasurer of Victoria. This was some great scandal, apparently, so scandalous that he told the Labor Party. But, Mr Speaker, Mr Walker is the chairman of the Fairfax companies. He's the chairman of the Commonwealth Games Organising Committee. He chaired major events for both the Labor and the Liberal Party, and he is a very respected businessman. And undoubtedly has every right to notify the government in relation to these matters. It's quite different, Mr Speaker, when somebody is lobbied by a convicted criminal like Brian Burke. Mr Speaker, Brian Burke has been convicted of fraud. Brian Burke has served time for his crimes. And, Mr Speaker, Brian Burke's reputation was so sullied that the Premier of Western Australia, Premier Gallop, banned any connection between Brian Burke and members of the West Australian government. And indeed, I pay tribute to the member for Perth, who yesterday said that he had not had a conversation with Brian Burke for a decade and a half. He said this, quote, "If only more people in Western Australia had followed that example. I don't believe that the activities and actions of Brian Burke, which have been exposed in the Corruption Commission established by a state Labor government, deserve anything other than complete and absolute condemnation." And we pay tribute to the member for Perth for taking that attitude. Mr Speaker, it will come of some considerable concern to members of this House to know that whilst Mr Burke was under a ban and whilst the member for Perth was refusing to deal with him, there was a member of this House who was flying into Western Australia regularly to meet with Mr Burke, and it was the Leader of the Opposition. Mr Speaker, we know that the Leader of the Opposition went to Mr Burke's favourite eatery in West Perth on the 1st of August 2005, Perugino's. Mr Speaker, we've had an explanation from the member for Cowan that the way this came about is that the Leader of the Opposition was staying with the member for Cowan. He had nothing to do that night, so the member for Cowan said, "Why don't we go down to Perugino's?" And guess who was there? The man in the Panama hat. Mr Brian Burke. It reminded me of that scene in Muriel's Wedding when the mistress of Bill Hunter walks into the Chinese restaurant and Bill Hunter says, "Deirdre Chambers, what a coincidence!" Brian Burke, what a coincidence, down here at Perugino's on the 1st of August 2005. I didn't know you were going to be here, Brian, and while I'm here I'll make a speech on China, because that's apparently what he did. He made a speech on China down in Perugino's restaurant. Now, Mr Speaker, it wasn't that he was just down in Perugino's with Brian Burke on the 1st of August 2005, whilst Burke was under a ban from Premier Gallop. It was that he happened to be in Western Australia in May for breakfast with Brian Burke. Brian Burke, what a coincidence! He's down at my breakfast place. And, Mr Speaker, in November of 2005, he happens to see him at lunch. Brian Burke at lunch. What a coincidence. Mr Speaker, 3 occasions in 2005, whilst a convicted criminal is under a ban from the Western Australian government, the Leader of the Opposition flies into Perth to have breakfast, lunch and dinner with Mr Brian Burke. Now, Mr Speaker, can I say this? Those who understand politics in this House will say it was no coincidence in 2005 when the Leader of the Opposition was looking for numbers for his leadership bid that he happened to be going regularly to Western Australia and meeting with Mr Brian Burke. Let me make another observation. Mr Brian Burke never does something for nothing, Mr Speaker. Mr Brian Burke has now been fingered
by the Crime Commission in Western Australia, and 3 ministers have lost their jobs because of their contacts with him. Mr. Speaker, because anyone who deals with Mr. Brian Burke is morally and politically compromised. And if the Leader of the Opposition thought that dealing with him in 2005 didn't sully him, it did. The member for Perth knows it, the people of Western Australia knows it, and the people of Australia deserve an explanation as to what he was doing there.
The order. The Honourable Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is to the Prime Minister.
Order. Order. The member has the call.
Can the Prime Minister provide the House with full details of contact between members of his government and former Liberal Senator Noel Crichton-Browne?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, yes.
And they differ.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. My contact with Senator Noel Crichton-Browne reached its climax 12 years ago, when as opposition leader I secured his removal from the Liberal Party Senate ticket in Western Australia.
Has the Prime Minister completed his answer?
Yes.
The Prime Minister has completed his answer. The Manager of Opposition Business.
About contact between members of his government.
He's asked his question and the Prime Minister has given an answer. The Honourable Member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Would the Minister update the House on any plans to advance regional cooperation against terrorism, and is the Minister aware of any alternative policies?
Good question.
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the question and the interest that members shown. Mr. Speaker, it won't be any surprise to members of this House that this government takes a very strong stand against terrorism all over the world, because this is not just a local problem or a regional problem. This is a global problem. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday I am going to Indonesia, and during the course of the early part of next week, the Attorney-General, the acting Commissioner for the Australian Federal Police, and I will participate in a sub-regional meeting on counter-terrorism. This meeting will include the foreign ministers and law enforcement ministers and police chiefs from regional countries, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore and Thailand. Mr. Speaker, we will be spending time early next week exploring ways to deepen our existing cooperation, which is very good, but also to address emerging challenges. How are we getting on in countering radicalisation? What more needs to be done? What narrative needs to be challenged? How should it be challenged? We'll also be looking at how we could more effectively respond in the event of mass casualty attacks, and we'll be looking at law enforcement cooperation and legal frameworks. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Hassan Wariuda, the Indonesian Foreign Minister, and I will open a regional leadership course for senior police at the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation, and I'll be addressing students at a Muslim university in Yogyakarta, visit a Muslim school that's part of AusAid's Islamic Education Assistance Program, and meet with other community and religious leaders. Mr. Speaker, let me say this about counter-terrorism in Southeast Asia. I think governments like the Indonesian government, I particularly mention them, Malaysia, Singapore, also more recently the Philippines, have been making real progress in their counter-terrorist activities. And very importantly and very noteworthy, there has been a decline in public support for terrorism and extremism in Indonesia. And it is important in the war against terrorism to understand that, and I don't think many people in Australia do. The last 2 years have been good years, not perfect years, but they have been good years in Southeast Asia in terms of counter-terrorism. There's a long way to go. There is still day by day the risk of terrorist attacks. There's no question of that. But nevertheless, real progress has been made, and I think next week our government will be able to take this matter further forward and with greater success. The honourable member asked me about a different approach. I think the Labor Party does have a very different approach. For a start, the Labor Party does not recognise that terrorism is a global problem. They think terrorism is just a sporadic problem. It's a bit of a problem maybe in Southeast Asia, and they say we need to bring troops back from Iraq to Southeast Asia to fight terrorism. I'm not quite sure where we'd be sending the troops in Southeast Asia to do this, but we look forward to that revelation. They think it's very important to fight terrorism in Afghanistan, but we should let the terrorists win in Iraq. It's important to let the terrorists win in Iraq and lose in Afghanistan and presumably lose in Southeast Asia. Mr. Speaker, it is completely incomprehensible. It is completely incomprehensible, and the most incomprehensible part of this is that the Labor Party never answers the question, because in their hearts, in his heart, the Leader of the Opposition knows the answer, that victory for terrorists in Iraq will be a massive boost for terrorism around the world, including in Southeast Asia. This is not a regional movement. This is a global movement. This is a global movement. And, Mr. Speaker, whether it's popular or whether it's unpopular, political leaders in this country owe it to this country to make sure that we do our absolute best for this country's security. And nobody could ever say that this government is anything but very strong and very determined on national security.
The Honourable Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that the West Australian CCC inquiry was told on 21 February of this year that former Liberal Senator Noel Crichton-Browne continues to exert influence on the internal operations of the Western Australian Liberal Party at the highest levels? Can the Prime Minister provide the House with full details of contact between members of his government and former Liberal Senator Noel Crichton-Browne in the period since Mr Crichton-Browne's removal from the Liberal Senate ticket?
The Honourable the Prime Minister.
Speaker, a couple of observations.
The Minister of Foreign Affairs.
I was not aware that Noel Crichton-Browne had been sent to jail, and maybe something has escaped me. But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware that he's been sent to jail for fraud. As to contact between him and people on our side of the House, if you want to ask other ministers, you can go ahead and do so. But if speaking for myself, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow being the 11th anniversary of the defeat of the Keating Labor government, Mr. Speaker, I well remember the year that led up to that, and I consumed inside my own party the first couple of months of that year in making sure that Noel Crichton-Browne was not on the Liberal Party Senate ticket for the election that brought my government to power, Mr. Speaker. And that involved taking him on. That involved going to Western Australia, not to consort with a convicted criminal, Mr. Speaker. It meant going to Western Australia to make certain that my party's Senate ticket did not have on it somebody who I regarded as unsuitable. And I was willing to do that as opposition leader because I regarded it as my obligation as the leader of the party. It involved some difficult confrontations with some people in the party, Mr. Speaker. I've never regarded that man's influence in the Western Australian division of my party as being anything other than rather negative, Mr. Speaker. But let us understand what this is all about. This is all about a double standard in the Australian Labor Party. I am meant to justify and explain to the last detail a telephone conversation I had in the course of my duty as Prime Minister of Australia with a very reputable businessman. Ron Walker's never been convicted of fraud. Hugh Morgan's never been convicted of fraud. Robert Champion de Crespigny's never been convicted of fraud. The three of them represent exemplars of ethics and good behaviour in the Australian business community. Hugh Morgan is a member of the board of the Reserve Bank. Robert Champion de Crespigny is an advisor to the South Australian Labor government. Ron Walker is proudly a former honorary federal treasurer of the Liberal Party, and he's now the chairman of the Fairfax Company. But, Mr Speaker, what this is all about is a double standard. I'm meant to explain every detail of that. The Treasurer is meant to explain every detail of that. But the Leader of the Opposition thinks he can skate by with some kind of generalised answer at a news conference in relation to his contact with Brian Burke, when anybody who has any understanding of Australian politics would suspect that what the Leader of the Opposition was about was touting for preferment and favour from a man of influence in the Labor Party in Western Australia, Mr Speaker. That's what we're on about. And let me say to the member for Grayndler, he can question me as often as he likes about the former senator from Western Australia, and I'll be very happy to go on answering in the vein that I have in the last two answers.
Yeah. Order. The honourable member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Health and Ageing. Would the Minister inform the House what the government has done to improve the position of nurses in Australia? Are there any alternative policies, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Health and Ageing.
Well, Mr Speaker, I do thank the member for Macon for her question, and I acknowledge the many years that she has spent in the great calling of nursing. And, Mr Speaker, thanks to the policies of the Howard government, there are now more nurses in Australia, and they are playing a more important role in our health system. According to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, there were just under 250,000 nurses in nursing in 2004, and that was an 11% increase since 1999. Since 2005, Mr Speaker, the Howard government has announced a further 3,000 nursing training places. Since 2001, the government has committed some $234 million to improving the position of nurses in general practice. Thanks to the government's policies, there are now at least 5,000 nurses working in general practice, and, Mr Speaker, those nurses are now supported by Medicare rebates, and this is the first time that this has happened under any Australian government. But, Mr Speaker, one thing the Howard government does not intend to do is to create a Commonwealth position of Chief Nursing Officer. And, Mr Speaker, didn't our failure to do this get the opposition very excited? Mr Speaker, last year the Deputy Leader of the Opposition said, and I quote, "At the most recent Nursing Leadership Conference in Sydney, Minister Abbott refused to appoint a chief nurse." It seems the Minister for Health is happy to talk about the role of nurses when it suits him, but has failed to take the profession of nursing seriously. A month later she said, "A Labor government will appoint a chief nursing officer to ensure Australian nurses have a voice in the federal government." So it couldn't be clearer. It couldn't be clearer. Labor will appoint a chief nurse. But hang on a minute. Hang on a minute, Mr Speaker. 2 years into his time as the de facto Premier of Queensland, the Leader of the Opposition sacked the Chief Nurse of Queensland, Mr Speaker. You know, Dr Death killed the Chief Nurse of Queensland.
Order.
I'm quoting.
The Minister will withdraw that reference.
I'm happy to assist the House by withdrawing. Mr Speaker, this is what the Leader of the Opposition's Health Minister in the Rudd Queensland Christian Socialist Labor government told Parliament in 1991. "I can confirm that under the restructured Department of Health, the position of Chief Nursing Officer for Queensland will disappear." Well, Mr Speaker, the members opposite, they think that the Commonwealth government, which doesn't employ nurses, must have a chief nurse, but the Queensland government, which employs tens of thousands of nurses, must not have a chief nursing officer. And what's now clear, Mr Speaker, is that members opposite, the Labor Party, actually has four. They actually have four health policies. Their first policy is to have a single funder for health, if you believe the Deputy Leader. Their second policy is not to have a single funder for health, if you believe the Shadow Minister for Federalism. Their third policy is to have a chief nurse, if you believe the Deputy Leader, and their fourth policy is not to have a chief nurse, if you believe the Leader of the Opposition when he was the de facto Premier of Queensland. Mr Speaker, he's a real piece of work, this bloke. He's a real piece of work, this bloke. He's not a socialist, but he is a Christian socialist. He attacks Howard's Brutopia, but he's happy to have Brian Burke as his West Australian numbers man, Mr Speaker. He's a disciple of Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he's seeking Christian votes, but he's the associate of Brian Burke when he wants support
order. The Minister will bring his answer to a conclusion.
He's the associate of Brian Burke when he wants support in caucus. I think the people of Australia are starting to get a sense of this bloke. They're starting to get a sense of this bloke. They understand deep down he's a phony. He's a phony, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the exclusive brethren directly supported his re-election in the seat of Bennelong at the last federal election?
Order. The Treasurer. The member for Grain will start his question again.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the exclusive brethren directly supported his re-election in the seat of Bennelong at the last federal election? Can the Prime Minister confirm this support included an extensive letterboxing campaign and attacks on other candidates at public meetings?
The Prime Minister.
Interesting, fascinating question. Mr Speaker, to start with, the exclusive brethren don't vote. I mean, that is the first thing I make. The second thing, if they letterboxing my favour, good on them, Mr Speaker. They show great taste. And let me also make it clear, Mr.
The member
Speaker,
for Grain has asked his question. The member for Lily is warned.
In the Australian community, the
member for
exclusive
Brisbane is
brethren
warned.
are entitled to express their views, and I make it clear that my door is open to any lawful organisation, and it is open to any group of people who have not been convicted of crimes, Mr Speaker. I mean, let's take it back to where the Treasurer put it. What we're talking about is the behaviour of the Leader of the Opposition supping with somebody who was under a ban by Dr Jeff Gallop and had been convicted of a crime. To my knowledge, as a group, the exclusive brethren have not been committed of a crime. Individuals may have, like individual people who are members of a church may have been, or individual atheists may have been, Mr Speaker. But as a group, they are a lawful organisation. And if the member for Grainville thinks that by this line of questioning he's going to intimidate me out of beating lawful organisation, he is wrong. And I encourage all the Burke people of Bennelong, whatever their faith or no faith may be, to vote Liberal.
Order. The honourable member for Page.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is directed to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. Would the Minister update the House on the way in which the government's workforce reforms have assisted women, young people and long-term unemployed back into work, particularly on the north coast of New South Wales? Is the Minister aware of any alternative views?
The Honourable Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Page for his question. And I note, in fact, that I read an article from the Northern Star with the headline, "Far North Coast Sheds Reputation as Nation's Dole Capital. Unemployment hits 30-year low as our region cashes in on the economic boom. And it cites no better authority than the federal member for Page, who said he saw the lifting of unfair dismissal laws gave local business owners confidence to employ more staff. So that's excellent, Mr Speaker. That's a good news story. Unemployment down to 5.6% on the north coast of New South Wales. And Mr Speaker, the unfair dismissal laws are job destroying. They've had a negative impact on small business. That's why we removed them, to provide an incentive for small business to go out and employ more Australians. And Mr Speaker, I was asked about alternative policies, and I note that the Labor Party has, to the best of my knowledge, 7 different policies on unfair dismissal laws in the last 7 months. 7 different policies. Policy number 1 from the member for Brown, the former Leader of the Opposition, was to abolish work choices and reinstate unfair dismissal laws. Policy number 2 was a transcript of the Deputy Leader of the Opposition on the ABC Insiders program, where she suggested they'd change the thresholds. Policy number 3 was to scrapped Beasley's policy on dismissal, and they flagged reinstatement. Policy number 4, the Shadow Minister for Small Business over there, in a speech to Cosboa, quite a landmark speech that said nothing, 27th of February. Mr Speaker, policy number 5, the next day, that fabulous interview with Madonna King on ABC. We won't forget that in a hurry, Mr Speaker. And there are a number of policies within policy position number 5 with Madonna King. Policy number 6, God bless her, Sharon Burrow. Yes, Mr Speaker. Policy number 6, Sharon Burrow was asked today, do you have the unequivocal support of federal Labor for wanting back work choices? Burrow, no question. There's an absolute commitment to reinstate the unfair dismissal laws. Mr Speaker, it goes further. Today there was an article in The Australian, and this is the next policy.
By Keven Rudd.
By Sid Marris, the article says Labor is debating internally how it can minimise a backlash from small business over its plan to wind back their exemption from unfair dismissal laws. Some in the Labor movement listen to this, some in the Labor movement are considering a special mediator who could go to a workplace to resolve a dispute. I thought, what sort of mediator? Well, Brian Burke, Mark Latham, there'll be a whole range of them, Speaker.
Order.
And I was reminded,
Order.
I was reminded of the article in the West Australian about a fellow by the name of Joe McDonald. And it says, Unionist Joe McDonald has vowed to continue breaking the law by trespassing on Perth building sites to conduct union business after police were called to remove him from a site yesterday when he refused about 24 requests to leave. It goes on to say the Assistant Secretary of the CFMEU conceded it was the 4th time in the past fortnight that police had been called to a building site to remove him, but on 2 occasions he left before they arrived. It is illegal for Mr McDonald to enter building sites after losing both his state and federal right of entry permits for behaviour, including bullying and harassment. I think this is a perfect sort of mediator that Sharon Burrow might have been considering, Mr Speaker, but the controversial unionist, it gets better, the controversial unionist admitted for the first time yesterday that the law would not stop him entering building sites. So no wonder Sharon Burrow wants to change the law. She wants to bring mediators like Joe McDonald into the workplace. And this is policy number 7. 7 policies in 7 months. Mr Speaker, they're not only walking both sides of the street when it comes to unfair dismissal laws, they're stuck on a Canberra roundabout and they can't get off. When is the Labor Party going to come up with a policy? Because at this stage, the only policy that Australian business can understand is the ACTU's policy, where they're going to have trade unionists going back into every workplace, where they're going to reintroduce the job-destroying unfair dismissal laws, and they're going to leave small business and Australian workers behind.
The Honourable Order. The Honourable the Manager of Opposition Business.
My question is again to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm reports in The Age on the 10th of February that the exposure of his links with the exclusive brethren has caused his office to ban contact between Liberal MPs and the exclusive brethren ahead of the next campaign? Are these reports accurate?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
PM, back to the mic.
The Honourable Prime Minister.
I'm sorry, the answer to the honourable gentleman's question is no.
Order! Order! The Minister for Agriculture. The Honourable Chief Government Whip.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Minister for Education, Science and Training. Would the Minister inform the House how the government is working towards greater consistency in Australian schools? Is she aware of any alternative views, and what is the government's response?
The Honourable Minister for Education, Science and Training.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Macquarie for his question, and I note his deep interest in developing education policy for this nation. Mr Speaker, earlier this month, the Australian government put on the agenda of the next Education Ministers' meeting in April a proposal for greater national consistency in curriculum. We are seeking higher standards of education in our schools through national consistency in curriculum. We want to set benchmarks for assessments across the country, and specifically for Year 12 certificates. We want a consistent national approach for assessment and reporting. And, Mr Speaker, we see this as a national priority. Wherever a student lives, they should have access to high-quality education, high-quality curriculum, and we want it to represent world's best practice, have Australia's national curriculum benchmarked internationally. And we don't want students, or indeed teachers, to be disadvantaged as they move between states. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about any alternative policies or views. Well, Labor does have some policies on education, and every single one has been a failure. Here is the totality. Members will remember the ALP education policy of the century. Remember Knowledge Nation. Remember that was the policy to beat all policies that was instantly dismissed as a joke. Noodle Nation then was shot down in flames, not only by their own side, but across the board. But I do recall that the member for Brand took the fall for the discredited Noodle Nation policy. They made the member for Brand take the fall for that. But members will be interested to know who the other authors of Noodle Nation were. Hands up. The other authors of Noodle Nation.
Order, 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 order. The Minister. Order.
Hands up.
The member for Holt. Order. The member for Port Adelaide. Order. The member for Canberra.
Mr Speaker, he should face the front.
Order. 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 The member for Port Adelaide is warned.
That boy's not facing the
The member for Bruce is warned. The Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, members would be interested to know that while the member for Brand took the fall on Noodle Nation, there were two other authors of Noodle Nation that haven't yet revealed themselves. None other than the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Perth. Take a bow, member for Griffiths, member for Perth for Noodle Nation. Mr Speaker, then we had the third policy, the third education policy. This was Mark Latham's schools hit list. Members will recall that the Labor Party wanted to rip the heart out of Catholic and independent schools. Their crime? They were private schools. And this was discredited because of the ugly politics of envy, the schools hit list of Mark Latham.
Order. The Minister resume her seat. The member for Fowler has been warned. She continues to interject. She will remove herself under Standing Order 94A. The Minister.
So we have the discredited Mark Latham schools hit list policy. But this year, where does Labor get its policy inspiration from?
The member for Cornwall.
None other
The member for Cornwall is warned. The Minister resume her seat. The member for Cornwall has been called to order. She has been warned. She continues to interject. She will remove herself under Standing Order 94A. The Minister. The Minister.
So after Mark Latham's discredited schools hit list policy, what do Labor come up with this year? They're now taking their policy inspiration from Mark, Education Revolution, Latham. Another one hits the dust. And then we've got the maths and science policy of Labor. That has been proven not to work, cutting HECS. It has been proven not to work. We've got the architect of HECS, Bruce Chapman, coming out and saying it will not work. This is the architect employed by Labor to introduce the HECS system. He says Labor's policy to cut HECS in maths and science will not work, and the unkindest cut of all, the Queensland Teachers Union says Labor's policy will not work. So even their own side says it won't work. Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order. Order.
Mr. Speaker, so that was, until yesterday, the totality of Labor's education policies. By yesterday, they'd run out of ideas, so they started pinching somebody else's homework. Labor on education gets an F for fail.
Order. The member for Bass. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is addressed to the Special Minister of State. How much money did the exclusive brethren spend on the 2004 election campaign to publish ads such as this in the Adelaide Advertiser, "Keep Howard Prime Minister"? And
order, order, order. Members on my right.
And how much money was spent on the production and distribution of the pamphlet "Keep Howard"
Sterling.
in Bennelong?
I haven't called the Minister yet. The Honourable Special Minister of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member for Greenlow can get any information he likes about the expenditure on the 2004, the 2001, 1998, whichever election he likes to choose, from the AEC website, which publishes all the expenditure.
That was a recording of yesterday's Question Time in the House of Representatives. Parliament's taking a break for the next 2 weeks, so we'll be back on Tuesday the 20th of March with Question Time from the House of Reps. In the meantime, you can see a wrap-up of this week in Parliament in Order in the House at 1:45 on Monday morning. Until then, good night from Parliament House in Canberra.